Hey guys. Okay, so I'm gonna just jump right on in because got a very loaded Friday. All right. So we were at the source on page 228, or if you have the online version, it's 6-2b, the source. Okay. So it starts off, golfer Tiger Woods is a living legend, one of the most gifted athletes of our time. Early in his career, he was paid more than just about anyone else to endorse Nike, American Express, and other products. Woods was considered the perfect spokesperson until 2009, when extramarital affairs were exposed, causing the breakup of his marriage, and various back injuries contributed to the demise of his championship caliber game. After struggling for many years, Woods was no longer top ranked or highly sought for endorsements. Then he made a remarkable comeback. In 2018, he won his first tournament in 5 years. In 2019, at the age of 43, and with a large gallery of spectators pulling for him, he won the coveted Masters tournament. Once again, he became highly sought and handsomely paid for product endorsements. The Woods brand was back. What does this three-phase story tell us about source effects in persuasion? More specifically, what does what makes some communicators in general more effective than others? As we'll see, there are two key attributes: credibility and likability. I'm going to highlight what makes some communicators in general more effective than others are two key attributes: credibility and likability. Okay, so credibility. Imagine you're waiting in line at a supermarket, and you catch a glimpse of this large, bold-faced headline: "Doctors discover cure for cancer." As your eye wanders across the front page, you discover you are reading a supermarket tabloid that features aliens from another planet. What would you think? In contrast, imagine that you're reading through scientific periodicals in a library when you come across a similar article, but this time it appears in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, what would you think? Chances are that you'd react with more excitement to the medical journal than to the tabloid. Even though both sources report the same news item, in a study conducted during the Cold War era of the 1950s, American participants read a speech that advocated for the development of nuclear submarines. The speech elicited more agreement when it was attributed to an eminent American physicist than when the source was said to be a Soviet government-controlled newspaper. Likewise, when participants read a lecture favoring more lenient treatment of juvenile offenders, they changed their attitudes more when they thought the speaker was a judge than a convicted drug dealer. Recent research confirms that high credibility sources are more persuasive than low credibility sources. I'm going to highlight that part. Recent research. Yeah. That summarizes those two paragraphs pretty well. Why are some sources more credible than others? Why were the medical journal, the physicist, and the judge more credible than the tabloid, the government-controlled newspaper, or the drug dealer? For communicators to be seen as credible, they have to have two characteristics: competence and trustworthiness. I'm going to highlight that. Competence refers to a speaker's ability. I'm also going to highlight that. People who are knowledgeable, smart, or well-spoken, or who have impressive credentials, are persuasive by virtue of their expertise. I may highlight that one too. Yeah. Experts can have a disarming effect on us. We assume they know what what they're talking about. So when they speak, we listen, and when they take a position, often we yield. Indeed, research shows that people pay closer attention to experts than non-experts. In court, forensic examiners with impressive credentials have a greater influence on juries than those with less impressive credentials, even when their testimony is the same. The impact of experts on our attention, confidence, and attitudes is not simple or uniform. The effect depends on how we feel about the attitude they advocate, say on politically charged issues such as gun control, immigration policy, or climate change, or vaccines. As suggested by the self-validation hypothesis described earlier, a highly credible source who argues for a position we tend to favor, yay, bolsters our confidence and existing attitude more than someone less credible would. In this case, there is less need for scrutiny, but a highly credible source who advocates for a position we oppose, yikes, poses a real threat to our confidence and existing attitude more than someone less credible. In this instance, we are wary of the expert more than the non-expert. Research is consistent with this nuanced hypothesis. People scrutinize non-experts more than experts when they advocate a position we agree with, but they scrutinize non-experts more when they advocate a position we oppose. They practically said the same thing again. Okay. So there's a lot of meat in that. I think I'm going to highlight that the impact of experts is not simple or uniform. A highly credible source who argues for a position we tend to favor bolsters our confidence and existing attitude. There is less need for scrutiny. And then a highly credible source who advocates for a position we oppose poses a real threat to our confidence in an existing attitude, more so than someone less credible. Actually, I didn't do that for the first, I'm not going to do it for this one. And then I'm going to highlight, we are wary. Yeah, that's what I did for the last one? Yeah. We are wary of the expert more than the non-expert. Okay, so next paragraph. Expertise is only one aspect of credibility. To have credibility, however, sources must also be trustworthy. That is, they must be seen as willing to report their knowledge truthfully and without compromise. That's a highlight. Sources must also be trustworthy, and its definition must be seen as willing to report their knowledge truthfully and without compromise. What determines whether we trust a communicator? To some extent, we make these judgments on the basis of stereotypes. In 2018, an update to a survey conducted many times over the years, the Gallup organization asked 1,000 Americans to rate how honest people are from various occupational categories. The Table 6.1 says nurses top the list as the most trusted occupational group, which they often do, followed by doctors and pharmacists, then car salespeople, members of Congress, and telemarketers on the least trusted. Dang. That's highly relevant right now. Yikes. Okay, so I'm going to highlight, to some extent, we make these judgments on the basis of stereotypes. Okay, in judging the credibility of a source, common sense arms us with a simple rule of caution. Beware of people who have something to gain from successful persuasion. If a speaker has been paid off, has an axe to grind, or is simply telling us what we want to hear, we suspect some degree of bias. This rule sheds light on a classic dilemma in advertising concerning the value of celebrity spokespersons. The more products a celebrity endorses, the less trustworthy he or she appears to consumers. I think the best one is beware of something. In judging a credibility source, common sense gives us our cautionary rule. Beware of people who have something to gain. Yeah, I think that's the most important. In a courtroom, the same rule of caution can be used to evaluate witnesses. In one study, research participants served as jurors in a mock trial involving a man who claimed that his exposure to an industrial chemical at work had caused him to contract cancer. Testifying in support of this claim was a biochemist paid either $4,800 or $75 for his expert testimony. You might think that jurors would be more impressed by a scientist who commanded the higher fee. Yet, that expert was perceived to be a hired gun, and as a result was less believable and less persuasive. Interesting. That's true. Like, you think about it, and we've heard that in 1630 and 1650 as well. If you pay participants more to do a study, sometimes that can have the opposite effect. Like the more money that you pay them, they go, oh God, what is the risk of this? And they become more cautious about wanting to be involved in the study. Same thing. If you're paying a expert witness thousands of dollars and just to show up, then yeah, it could be seen as a bribe. Even though they're an expert in their field, the more money it seems. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I think that's all examples, so I'm just going to skip it. The self-interest rule has other interesting implications. One is that people are impressed by others who take unpopular stands or argue against their own interests. When research participants read a political speech accusing a large corporation of polluting a local river, those who thought the speechmaker was a pro-environment candidate addressing a staunch environmentalist group perceived him to be biased. Whereas those who thought he was a pro-business candidate talking to company supporters assumed that he was sincere. Yeah. I think that's the reason why certain news channels who have a history of being seen as biased towards a specific race or specific ethnicity or people of certain political affiliations, if they have an expert come in who supports their beliefs or essentially gives them the air of justification in what they do, it makes them seem like, oh, but this person is who you say we're speaking ill of, and they support our position. So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I could understand that. Trust is also established by speakers who do not purposefully try to change our views. Thus, people are influenced more when they think they are accidentally overhearing the communication than when they receive a sales pitch clearly intended for their ears. That's why advertisers sometimes use the overheard communicator trick, in which the source appears to tell a buddy about a new product that works, as if eavesdropping on a personal conversation. Viewers assume that what one friend says to another can be trusted. The self-interest rule also has great relevance in law, which is why people are far more likely to believe a crime suspect's admission of guilt than his or her denials. Yeah, that makes sense too. Okay, there's a lot of meat, and I just realized I didn't highlight anything in the self-interest rule or below. Um, I think one is that people are impressed by others who take an unpopular stand or argue against their own self-interests. Um, Trust is also established by speakers who do not purposely try to change our views. Yeah, yeah. I think those are pretty self explanatory. Okay, likability. More than anything else, the celebrity star power of Tiger Woods was based on his athletic prowess, his popularity, and his winning smile. Before the revelations that ended Woods' marriage and injuries that derailed his game, he was seen as a likable person. Now, as the underdog who fought his way back up, he regained his popularity. But does that necessarily enhance someone's impact as a communicator? It's possible. In his classic bestseller, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie in 1936 said that being liked and being persuasive go hand in hand. The question is, what makes a communicator likable? In particular, two factors can spark attraction: similarity and physical attractiveness. Okay, so I think what makes a communicator likable are two factors that spark attraction: similarity and physical attractiveness. All right. In a study by Diane Mackey and others in 1990, it illustrates the persuasive power of similarity. Students enrolled at the University of California, Santa Barbara read a strong or weak speech that argued against continued use of the SATs in college admissions. Half the participants were led to believe that the speech was written by a fellow UCSB student. The other half thought the author was a student at the University of New Hampshire. Very few participants were persuaded by the weak arguments. In contrast, many of those who read the strong message did change their attitudes, but only when they believed it was given by a fellow UCSB student. Interesting. Okay, so the weak message is a weak message, but the strong messages, the people who changed their attitudes only did if they believed that it was a student from the same school. That's interesting. Okay. All right. It's a good example, but I think I'm just going to put the off to the side. All right. Just as a source similarity can spark persuasion, dissimilarity can have the opposite inhibiting effect. In a study of people's taste in music, Clayton Hilmer and others in 2006 introduced participants to a Confederate who seemed to like the same or different kinds of music, such as rock, pop, country, or classical. Others did not meet a Confederate. When later asked to rate a particular song, participants were positively influenced by the similar Confederate's opinion and negatively influenced by the dissimilar Confederate's opinion. They were also more or less persuaded by a Confederate whose similarities or differences were wholly unrelated to music. For example, when the Confederate had similar or different interests in shopping, politics, museums, food, or social media websites. That's phenomenal. Okay, that's crazy. So we are attracted to people who we find similarities with. And if we find someone who's too dissimilar from us, what they like begins to repel us. That's amazing. Okay, so sorry, can you tell I'm a nerd? Okay. Um, as a source of similarity can spark persuasion, dissimilarity can have the opposite inhibiting effect. The effect of source similarity on persuasion has obvious implications for those who wish to exert influence. We're all similar to one another in some respects. We might agree in politics, we might share the same Pinterests, we have a common friend, have similar tastes in food, or enjoy spending summers on the same beach. In light of the social benefits of similarity, the social costs of dissimilarity. Oh, and the social costs of dissimilarity. The astute communicator can use common bonds to enhance his or her impact on an audience. I think that's important. Effects have obvious implications to exert influence, and the astute communicator can use common bonds to enhance their impact on an audience. Yep. Advertising practices presuppose that beauty is also persuasive. After all, online magazine, TV ads, they all routinely feature supermodels who are young and slender for women, or tall and muscular for men, and who sport hard bodies, glowing light or dark complexions, and radiant smiles. Sure, these models can turn heads, you may think, but can they change minds? In a study that addressed this question, Shelley Chaikin, I think it's Chaikin, in 1979, had male and female college students approach others on campus. They introduced themselves as members of an organization that wanted the university to stop serving meat during breakfast and lunch. In each case, these student assistants gave reasons for the position and then asked the respondents to sign a petition. The result was that attractive sources were able to get 41% of respondents to sign the petition, whereas those who were less attractive succeeded only 32% of the time. It's like a 10% difference. Okay, additional research has shown that attractive male and female salespersons elicit more positive attitudes and purchasing intentions from customers than less attractive salespersons, even when they're upfront about their desire to make a sale. I think the most important one there is that beauty is also persuasive. In the very first line. And research has shown that attractive male and female salespersons elicit positive purchasing intentions than less attractive. Yeah, I think that's going to be important. Or not, but I think it's enough that I want to highlight it for easy access when reading through the book again. Okay, when what you say is more important than who you are. To this point, it must seem as if the source of a persuasive communication is more important than the communication itself. Is this true? Certainly, there are enough real-life examples as when books once skyrocketed to the top of the bestseller list because Oprah Winfrey recommended them. The advertising industry has long debated the value of high-priced celebrity endorsements. David Ogilvy, I think it's Ogilvy, in 1985, who was called the king of advertising, has said that celebrities are not effective because viewers know they've been bought and paid for. Ogilvy was not alone in his skepticism. Still, many advertisers scramble furiously to sign famous entertainers and athletes, from Tiger Woods to Tina Fey, Rihanna, LeBron James, Taylor Swift, Scarlett Johansson, Ronda Rousey, Beyonce, Katy Perry, and Jay-Z. TV commercials regularly feature a parade of stars. The bigger the star, they say, the more valuable the testimonial. Compared with the contents of a message, does the source really make the big difference that advertisers pay for? Are we so impressed by the expert, so enamored by the physical talent, and so drawn to the charming face that we embrace whatever they have to say? And are we so scornful of ordinary or unattractive people that their presentations fall on deaf ears in light of what is known about the central and peripheral routes to persuasion? The answer to these questions is it depends. I love that. Just line it all up and just end it with two words. It depends. Oh, God. I think I had a professor who said, if you get nothing else from taking psychology, learn that every single psychological question can be answered with, it depends. I can't remember who it was. I'm going to have to think about that because it was hilarious and so freaking true. Okay. Yeah, I think that is the most important line. In light of what is known about the different routes of persuasion, the answer to this question is it depends. First, a recipient's level of involvement plays an important role. When a message has personal relevance to your life, you pay attention to the source and you think critically about the message, the arguments, and the implications. When a message does not have personal relevance, however, you may take the source at face value and spend little time scrutinizing the information. In a classic study, Richard Petty and others in 1981 had students listen to a speaker who proposed that all seniors should be required to take comprehensive exams in order to graduate. I think they've talked about this before in the book. 3 aspects of the communication situation were varied. First, participants were led to believe that the speaker was either an educated professor at Princeton University or a high school student. Second, participants heard either fact-based arguments or a weak message based on anecdotes and personal opinion. And then third, participants were told either that the I'm so tongue twisted today, proposed exams might be used the following year, meaning those students, or that they would not take effect for another 10 years. Who cares? I'll be gone. As predicted, personal involvement determined the relative impact of the expertise of the source and the quality of the speech. Among participants who would not be affected by the proposed change, attitudes were based largely on the speaker's credibility. The professor was persuasive, the high school student was not. Among participants who thought that the proposed change would affect them directly, attitudes were based on the quality of the speaker's proposal. Strong arguments, persuasive. Weak arguments were not. As depicted in figure 6.8, people followed the source rather than the message under low levels of involvement, illustrating peripheral route to persuasion. But message factors did outweigh source characteristics under high levels of involvement when participants cared enough to take the central route to persuasion. Likewise, research has shown that the tilt toward likable and attractive communicators is reduced when the recipients take the central route. I think that's important. Research has shown the tilt towards likable and attractive reduced when they took the central route. All right. Personal involvement determined the relative impact of the expertise of the source and quality of the speech. The first sentence in the second paragraph, I think, is important. And that first sentence, recipient's level of involvement plays an important role. Well, that's kind of the same thing. They've essentially said it once, given an example, reiterated it again, and then ended with this is our conclusion, and they all say pretty much the same thing. So take from that what you will. I have a feeling this whole page is going to be important. I have that feeling. Okay, there is a second limit to source effects. It is often said that time heals all wounds. Well, time may also heal the effects of a bad reputation. Hovland and Weiss in 1951 varied communicator credibility. For example, the physicist versus the Soviet-controlled newspaper, and found that the change had a large and immediate effect on persuasion. But when they measured attitudes again 4 weeks later, the effect had vanished. Over time, the attitude change produced by the high credibility source had decreased, and the change caused by the low credibility source had increased. This finding of a delayed persuasive impact of a low credibility communicator was called the sleeper effect. Key term. I'm going to highlight it. Time may also heal the effects of a bad reputation. To explain this unforeseen result, the Hovland Research Group proposed the discounting cue hypothesis. I'm going to highlight that. According to this hypothesis, people immediately discount the arguments made by non-credible communicators, but over time they dissociate what was said from who said it. In other words, we tend to remember the message but forget the source. I think all of that is important. According to this hypothesis, people immediately discount the arguments made. In other words, we tend to remember the message but forget the source. Yeah, all of that is important. To examine the role of memory in this process, Kelman and Hovland in 1953 reminded a group of participants of the source's identity before reassessing their attitudes. If the sleeper effect was caused by forgetting, they reasoned. Then it could be eliminated through reinstatement of the link between the source and the message. And the figure 6.9 shows they were right. When attitudes were measured after 3 weeks, participants were not reminded of the source, showed the usual sleeper effect. Yet, those who did receive a source reminder did not. For these later participants, the effects of high and low credibility endured. Recent studies by cognitive psychologists have confirmed that over time, people forget the connection between information and its source. Yeah, so that's interesting. If you hear a really good argument for something, even if you don't like the source that it comes from, with time, that mulls in your brain and your brain just chews it over. And even when you forget the source, the message stays. And if it's convincing enough, you'll take that position. Interesting. That's really cool. At first, the sleeper effect generated some controversy. There was never a doubt that credible communicators lose some impact over time, but researchers had a harder time finding evidence for delayed persuasion by non-credible sources. Exasperated at one point by their own failures to obtain this result, Paulette Gillig and Anthony Greenwald in 1974 wondered, is it time to lay the sleeper effect to rest? As it turned out, the answer was no. More recent research showed that the sleeper effect is reliable provided that participants do not learn who the source is after they have received the original message. Okay, I'm going to highlight that. I'm also going to highlight from the other paragraph. No, I'm going to leave it at that. Yep. All right, to appreciate the importance of timing, imagine that you're about to search Spotify or some other streaming music service for songs from a band you like. All of a sudden, you come across a review of the band's newest CD. Before you begin reading, however, you notice in the fine print that this so called review is really an advertisement. Aware that you can't always trust what you read, you skim the ad, rejected. Now imagine the same situation, except that you read the entire ad before realizing what it is. Again, you reject it. But notice the difference. This time, you've read the message with an open mind. You may still reject it, but after a few weeks, man, that information will have sunk in to influence your evaluation of the music. This scenario illustrates the sleeper effect. Okay, this whole scenario, I'm going to say, is important because it might get used as an example. At a time, so I've bracketed the whole paragraph and just put a little symbol. All right, so at a time when so many of us read news articles online, often followed by user comments, the sleeper effect has important implications. Research shows that negative user comments, especially from a credible source, lead readers on the spot to dismiss the position espoused in an article, making it less persuasive. But when attitudes were measured after a delay of 2 weeks, an article accompanied by negative versus positive comments regained its persuasiveness. In this case, readers had processed and retained the essential message. Yeah, so they've essentially just given another example. I think that's fine. I think we all get it. All right, the message. On the peripheral route to persuasion, audiences are influenced heavily, maybe too heavily, by various source characteristics. But when people care about an issue, the strength of a message determines its impact. When people care about an issue, the strength of a message determines its impact. Yeah. On the central route to persuasion, what matters most is whether a scientist's theory is supported by the data or whether a company has a sound product. Keep in mind, however, that the target of a persuasive appeal comes to know a message only through the medium of communication, what a person has to say and how that person says it. So, informational strategies. Communicators often struggle with how to structure and present an argument to maximize its impact. Should a message be crammed with facts or short and to the point? Is it better to present a highly partisan, one-sided message or a more balanced, two-sided approach? How should arguments be ordered, from strongest to weakest or the other way around? These are the kinds of questions often studied by persuasion researchers, including those interested in marketing, advertising, and consumer behavior. I think the first sentence, and it's often studied by persuasion researchers, those interested in marketing, advertising, and consumer behavior. I think I'm just going to put that into one note about that. Often the most effective strategy to use will depend on whether members of the audience process the message on the central or the peripheral route. Consider the length of a communication. When people process a message lazily, with their eyes and ears half closed, they often fall back on a simple heuristic. The longer the message, the more valid it must be. In this case, a large number of words gives the superficial appearance of factual support regardless of the quality of the arguments. Thus, as David Ogilvy in 1985 concluded from his years of advertising experience, quote, "The more facts you tell, the more you sell." I think that's going to be important. Okay, so the more facts you tell, the more you sell. David Ogilvy, 1985, and I think When people process a message lazily, they often fall back on a simple heuristic. The longer the message, the more valid it must be. Yeah. When people process a communication carefully, however, length is a two-edged sword. If a message is too long because it contains lots of supporting information, then longer does mean better. The more supportive arguments you can offer, or the more sources you can find to speak on your behalf, the more persuasive your appeal will be. But if the added arguments are weak or the new sources are redundant, then an alert audience will not be fooled by length alone. When adding to the length of a message dilutes its quality, an appeal might well lose impact. When people process a communication carefully, however, adding to the length of a message, when adding to the length of a message dilutes its quality, the appeal might lose impact. Okay, when two opposing sides try to persuade the same audience, order of presentation becomes a relevant factor as well. If two opposing sides present their positions, do you think the order of their presentation matters? If you believe that the information presented first has more impact, you'd predict a primary effect, or a primacy effect. If you believe the information presented last has the edge, then you predict a regency effect. There are good reasons for both predictions. On the one hand, first impressions are important. On the other hand, memory fades over time, and often people will recall only the last argument they heard before making a decision. Okay. I think that middle section is the most important. Information presented first has more impact, primacy effect. Information presented last has an edge, regency effect. And both reasons are good. There are good reasons for both predictions. Both predictions have good reasons. Oh my gosh, I'm having such a hard time today. Okay. In light of these contrasting predictions, Norman Miller and Donald Campbell in 1959 searched for the missing link that would determine the relative effects of primacy and regency. They discovered that the missing link is time. In a study of jury simulations, they had people, 1, read a summary of the plaintiff's case, 2, read a summary of the defendant's case, and 3, make a decision. The researchers varied how much time separated the two messages and then how much time elapsed between the second message and the decisions. When participants read the second message right after the first and then waited a whole week before reporting their opinion, primacy effect prevailed. And the side that came first was favored. Both messages faded equally from memory, so only the greater impact of the first impression was left. When participants made a decision immediately after the second message, but a full week after the first, however, there was regency effect. The second argument was fresher in memory, thus favoring the side that went last. Okay, I think the most important thing is that the missing link that determines relative effects of primacy and regency is time. Message discrepancy. Persuasion is a process of changing attitudes. This objective is not easy to achieve. As a general rule, people are motivated to defend their positions, which they do in part through selective exposure to information that supports their views. Given an opportunity to advocate for attitude change, communicators confront what is perhaps the most critical strategic question. How extreme a position should they take? How discrepant should a message be from the audience's existing position in order to have the greatest impact? Common sense suggests two opposite answers. One approach is to take an extreme position and the hope that the more you change, the more change you advocate, the more you will get. Another approach is to not push for too much change so that the audience will not reject the message outright. Like, I guess a good example of that would be trying to advocate that meat eaters should just not eat any meat and go full vegan. Um, Doing that to like a very rural, brought up on steak and potatoes for breakfast cowboy might be a little. I can almost guarantee they might outright just reject that. But each one has merit, so I get that. Which approach seems more effective? Imagine trying to convert your politically conservative friends into liberals, or the other way around. Would you stake out a radical position in order to move them toward the center, or would you preach moderation so as not to be cast aside? Research shows that communicators should adopt the second, more cautious approach. To be sure, some discrepancy is needed to produce a change in attitude, but the relationship to persuasion can be pictured as an upside down U, with the most change being produced at moderate amounts of discrepancy. I like that. Okay, that's important. Okay. One approach. Okay, hold on. Persuasion is a process of changing attitudes. Greatest impact suggests two opposite answers. An extreme position in the hope the more you change, the more change you advocate, the more you will get. I can't. Or to not push too much so that the audience will not reject it outright. The relationship to persuasion, the last sentence, the relationship to persuasion can be pictured as an upside down U with the most change being produced at moderate amounts of discrepancy, I think is the most critical in that whole sentence. Okay, now for the studies. A study by Carrie Edwards and Edward Smith in 1996 helps explain why taking a more extreme position is counterproductive. These investigators first measured people's attitudes on some hot social issues. Several weeks later, they asked the same people to read, think about, and rate arguments that were either consistent or not consistent with their own prior attitudes. The result, when given arguments to read that preached attitudes that were discrepant from their own, the participants spent more time scrutinizing the material and judging the arguments to be weak. Clearly, people tend to refute and reject persuasive messages they do not agree with. In fact, the more personally important an issue is to us, the more stubborn and resistant to change we become. Yep. People tend to refute and reject persuasive messages they don't agree with, and the more personally important an issue is, the more stubborn and resistant to change we become. Okay, appeals to emotion. Politicians, trial lawyers, marketing experts, and others say that persuasion efforts should be aimed at the heart rather than through the mind. Policy arguments, evidence, and product attributes are important, they admit. But to motivate a change in attitude, they should also arouse anger, disgust, sympathy, sadness, and other emotions. I think that's important. Persuasion efforts should be aimed at the heart rather than through the mind. To motivate change in attitude, they should also arouse emotions. Okay. As social creatures, it seems that we instinctively know that emotionality is persuasive. In a series of studies, Matthew Rockledge and others in 2018 asked people to evaluate something either with or without an intent to persuade others. Then they analyzed the language used in each participant's appeal by measuring the use of highly emotionality words, such as amazing, awful, loved, hated. In one experiment, for example, they recruited 1,285 adults to write an online review of one of 20 consumer products. Half of the participants were asked to merely write a positive 5-star review. The other half was told their goal was to persuade readers to purchase the product. Afterward, the researchers analyzed the language used in these reviews. The results were clear. Compared to 840 reviews of the same products posted on Amazon.com, and compared those written without an intent to persuade, participants in the intent to persuade group used more emotional language. Follow-up studies showed that our tendency to express more emotion when trying to persuade happens spontaneously. Oh man, okay, so I think we instinctively know that emotionality is persuasive. And then our tendency to express more emotion when trying to persuade others happens spontaneously. Yeah. Okay, fear appeals. Ooh. Fear is particularly primitive and powerful emotion, serving as an early warning system that signals danger. Neuroscience research shows that fear is aroused instantly in response to pain, stimulation from noxious substances, or threat, enabling us to respond quickly without having to stop to think about it. The use of fear-based appeals to change attitudes is common. Certain religious cults have used scare tactics to indoctrinate new members. So do public health organizations that graphically portray the damage done to those who smoke cigarettes or eat too much junk food, drink too much alcohol, text while driving, or have unprotected sex. Although the effect, I'm gonna, hold on. That paragraph is pretty potent. Fear is particularly a primitive and powerful emotion. It signals danger. That whole sentence is important. It enables us to respond quickly without having to stop and think about it. And the use of fear-based appeals to change attitudes is common. Okay. Although the effect on voters is not clear, negative campaigning in American politics is prevalent, as described in books with such titles as Going Dirty or Nasty Politics. It is clear that negativity floods the political scene. This practice suggests that candidates, their consultants, and their super PACs, political action committees, strongly believe in the power of attacking their opponents by arousing fear about the consequences of voting for them. Presidential campaign ads are more negative than ever, yet the most hard-hitting and controversial ever was a TV commercial that aired just once, on September 7th, 1964. In an ad to re-elect Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, who was running against Republican Barry Goldwater, a young girl pictured in a field counted to 10 as she picked the petals off a daisy. As she reached 9, an adult voice broke in to count down from 10 to 0, followed by a blinding nuclear explosion and the message, "Vote for President Johnson on November 3. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." The effects of fear arousal in politics are evident, guided by terror management theory. You know what? Yeah, I don't think I'm going to highlight anything from that thus far. We all know negative campaigning is prevalent in politics. It's pretty memorable in any case. Okay, so the effects of fear arousal in politics are evident, guided by terror management theory and the prediction that a deeply rooted fear of death motivates people to rally around their leaders to ward off anxiety. Mark Landau and others in 2004 found that college students expressed more support for then President George W. Bush and his policies when reminded of their own mortality or subliminally exposed to images of 9/11 than when they were not. This result is not limited to the laboratory. Analyzing patterns of government-issued terror warnings and Gallup polls, Robert Willer in 2004 found that increased terror alerts were predictably followed by increases in presidential approval ratings. I think I'm just going to highlight that line. The effects of fear arousal in politics are evident. Is fear similarly effective for commercial advertising purposes or to promote health and safety? For a glimpse at the answer, visit the website of the Ad Council, the organization that created Smokey Bear, "Only you can prevent forest fires," and the Crash Test Dummies, "Don't be a dummy, buckle up." In recent years, the Ad Council has run campaigns on a range of issues, such as dangers of using steroids, flu prevention, AIDS prevention, suicide prevention, and cyberbullying. To get people to change behavior in these domains, is it better to arouse a little nervousness or a full-blown anxiety attack? To answer this question, social psychologists over the years have compared communications that vary in the levels of fear they arouse. In the first such study, Irving Janis and Seymour Feshbach in 1953 found that high levels of fear did not generate increased agreement with a persuasive communication. Ooh, that's interesting. I didn't expect that. Found that high levels of fear did not generate increased agreement with persuasive communication. Since then, however, research has shown that appeals that arouse high levels of fear can be highly effective. Okay, so that's 2. Is it or isn't it? Let's read the next paragraph. Maybe that's where they're concluding. Fear arousal increases the incentive to change for those who do not actively resist it, but its ultimate impact depends on the strength of the arguments and on whether the message also contains clear and reassuring advice on how to cope with the threatened danger. Yeah, I'm going to highlight that. That sounds imperative. Fear arousal increases, but its ultimate impact depends on the strength of the message and reassuring advice on how to cope with the threatened danger. Okay. This last point is important. Without specific instructions on how to cope, people feel helpless, panic, and tune out the message. In one study, for example, participants with a chronic fear of cancer were less likely than others to detect the logical errors in a message that called for regular cancer checkups. When clear instructions are included, however, high dosages of fear can be effective. In the past, research has shown that anti-smoking films elicit more negative attitudes towards cigarettes when they show gory lung cancer operations rather than charts filled with dry statistics, and that films about driving safety are more effective when they show bloody accident victims rather than simple plastic crash test dummies. In a meta-analysis of 105 studies, however, Natasha DeHoog and others in 2007 found that communications that arouse fear do not have to be gruesome to be effective. The more personally vulnerable people feel about a threatened outcome, the more attentive they are to the message and more likely they are to follow its recommendations. Okay, so I think the most important part about this is without specific instructions how to cope, people feel helpless, panic, and tune out the message. When clear instructions are included, however, high dosages of fear can be effective. The more personally vulnerable people feel about a threatened outcome and the more attentive they are to the message, the more likely they are to follow its recommendations. Those three sentences after the fear arousal at the beginning, I think are critical. Okay, I think it's been an hour. I'm going to stop. And we've gone through about 10 pages, so we're pretty good on time. I am going to take all my highlighted notes and consolidate them into my typed notes, or if you write them down, either way, that's fine. But yeah, hope you guys have a good weekend. I'm going to get on again tomorrow and do the second to last bit. So I think, yeah, I think there's only 20 pages left. I'm going to do 10 tomorrow and 10 on Sunday, and then we'll be done, guys. You'll have all your notes that you need for chapter 6. Hopefully this has helped you guys. I will see you tomorrow. Enjoy your Friday.